perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at a woman's face. In front of 4 wealthy couples, in front of a frozen sommelier holding a $600 bottle of wine, too afraid to move, unsure whether to pour it or simply turn and walk away. Can you even read? Or where you're from? They just didn't have schools. The words landed like a slap in a room that cost $680 a plate. Belgian linen on every table. Crystal glasses worth $90 each. A view of Manhattan stretching out in glowing silence far below, and the woman on the receiving end, a waitress in a black apron, gripping a leather menu so tightly her fingers had gone white, didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She counted 2-3 in her head, took one steadying breath, and said absolutely nothing at all. This is Unstoppable Stories, and today you'll discover how one silent waitress, humiliated in front of a room full of millionaires, was quietly holding a secret worth over $900,000, and how the woman who tried to destroy her ended up destroying herself instead. Her name was Valerie Sterling, 34 years old, 18 months into a waitressing job at Celestial 34, a glass-walled restaurant on top of a Manhattan skyscraper. The kind of place where a reservation took 3 weeks of waiting, and the tablecloths alone cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill. She had arrived at that restaurant with nothing but a small worn suitcase and a manila envelope full of recommendation letters nobody had asked for. The general manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor, hired her the same afternoon, struck by something in Valerie's eyes that she couldn't quite name. Punctual, discreet, impossibly precise. Valerie arrived every shift 10 minutes early. She left 10 minutes late, without anyone ever having to ask. She never once wrote an order down on a notepad. She simply remembered it. Every detail, every allergy, every substitution, filed away in a memory that never seemed to fail her, no matter how complicated the table. Nobody asks why. Nobody ever does, with people who work quietly and never complain. Nobody knew that 8 years earlier, Valerie Sterling had been someone else, entirely. A graduate student at Columbia University, hunched over her favorite desk on the 4th floor of the economics building, by a window that caught the afternoon light until exactly 5 o'clock. A woman who color-coded her research in blue and red ink. Blue for the concepts that mattered, red for the details she refused to forget. She spent 4 relentless years writing 142 dense pages on international trade policy in emerging markets. Work so rigorous that her own advisor once called her, in front of the entire department, the most dedicated student he had taught in 20 years. That version of her had a future laid out in ink, a name on a legal document, a 17% ownership stake in a company, earned not through luck or connections, but through an entire agonizing year of brutal, brilliant market analysis work that became the actual blueprint for that company's national expansion. And then she met a man named Marcus Foster. A was 36, ambitious, a junior partner at a prestigious financial firm, the kind of man who had a way of making every room feel like it existed for him. He told her, with total conviction, that she was the most brilliant person he had ever met. He whispered about a limitless future they would build side by side, until she finally signed her name into the 4th clause of a partnership agreement. 12 pages of dense legal language she had read twice, carefully, the way she read everything. 6 months later, he handed her a second document. A routine amendment, he called it, a minor technical fix requested by a fussy notary. She meant to read every line the way she always did, but she was 10 days into a brutal flu, her head thick with cotton, her judgment dulled by exhaustion. She trusted him. That was her only mistake. 2 years passed before she went looking for her shares, only to discover, officially, legally, that she had never actually owned anything at all. Her name was missing from the clause that once held their entire future. Marcus was gone by then, vanished with another woman, taking with him for years of her life and the analysis she had built with her own 2 hands. She didn't fight. She had no money to fight with, no lawyer, no proof anyone would believe. What she had was a suitcase, a folder of letters no one had ever asked to see, and a job carrying wine to people who would never imagine she once wrote contracts instead of clearing plates. That night, the reservation at the best table in the house belonged to Richard Vanderpool, general director of a wine importing company valued at over $4 million. His mother, Lauren Vanderpool, arrived 20 minutes late. heels echoing across the marble floor, an $85,000 crocodile skin bag draped over her arm, a fact she mentioned no fewer than 4 times before the appetizers had even landed. She ignored Valerie's polite greeting entirely. She snapped at a simple, standard question about allergies, as though it were an insult to her intelligence. And when the third course arrived, a carefully curated cheese board, exactly as ordered, Lauren decided, in front of everyone, that she had never ordered it at all, and accused Valerie of implying she couldn't read her own menu. That's when the finger came up. That's when the entire table went quiet. That's when Lauren Vanderpool asked a working woman, loudly and without a shred of shame, whether her hometown even had a school. Valerie set the board down gently, walked back into the kitchen without a single tremor in her steady hands, and leaned against the cold steel wall where no one could see her. She let herself feel it for exactly 1 moment. Then she straightened her apron and went back to work. That night, when she collected the bill, she found her tip tucked under a crystal glass. A single, crumpled $2 bill, folded into 4. She kept it, not out of spite. As a reminder, by the weekend, Lauren wasn't finished. She called the restaurant demanding Valerie be permanently pulled off the floor. She sent a screenshot to her friends, along with a stolen photograph of Valerie's back, casually asking how she could ruin the woman's humble little life. She filed a formal complaint with a corporate office, claiming disrespect and misconduct that had never actually happened. And on Monday morning, Valerie found herself sitting across from a human resources director in a windowless conference room, being told, gently and professionally, that her safety required a quiet reassignment. Corporate language for being pushed out the door without technically being fired. At that moment, it felt like everything Valerie had rebuilt, piece by piece, shift by shift, over 8 long years, was about to be taken from her all over again by people who had never once had to work for anything in their entire lives. The question was simple, and it settled over her like the cold outside. Would she let it happen a second time? She didn't cry in that meeting. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She simply thanked the woman across the desk, walked out into the freezing New York air, and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before pulling out her phone. She dialed the number she hadn't called in 3 years. "Professor Fuller," she said, when the line finally connected. "This is Valerie Sterling. I need to speak with you. It's urgent, but it's not quite an emergency yet." Irene Fuller had once taught Valerie that a contract wasn't just paper. It was a battlefield, and most people never learned to read the terrain before walking onto it. For 8 years, Valerie had buried that lesson under double shifts and aching feet. Now, standing on a cold Manhattan street, she dug it back up. She wasn't running from the humiliation anymore. She was done being underestimated in silence. Done letting people who had never once been tested assume they understood exactly who she was. That night, she visited her grandfather, Arthur, 84 years old, in his tiny room that smelled of liniment and fresh bread. She brought him warm milk and pastries, and sat with him at his small table, admitting for the first time in years just how tired she really was. Not from the restaurant, but from carrying an old injustice alone for so long. He reminded her, gently, of the strong women in their family, and told her plainly that whatever had been stolen from her had never actually stopped being hers. "I may have lost everything once," she told him. "I'm not going to lose it twice." The fight that followed wasn't fast, and it certainly wasn't glamorous. Eat was Hirene hunched over a cluttered desk in a Brooklyn office stacked floor to ceiling with law books, combing through public notary records for a contract signed back in 2016. It was Valerie remembering, word for word, the name of a notary she had only glanced at once, Arthur Sterling, memorable only because it happened to share her grandfather's last name. It was long nights spent piecing together a paper trail while she still clocked in for lunch service the next morning. Steele smiled politely at strangers who had no idea what she carried home with her on the subway every single night. It was Richard Vanderpool, the son, not the mother, quietly beginning to ask his own uncomfortable questions, waiting outside the restaurant's service entrance in the freezing afternoon, showing her screenshots his mother never meant for him to see, slowly, reluctantly admitting that his own family's empire may have been partly built on something that was never rightfully theirs. And this is exactly why stories like these are shared here on Unstoppable Stories, because sometimes the biggest victories begin in the quietest, darkest moments, long before anyone else even notices something has started to shift. Eventually, Irene found what they needed. A 2014 contract, properly notarized, clearly listing Valerie as a 17% partner, and a 2016 amendment with a forged signature and a fraudulent notary stamp from an office whose actual notary had been dead for over a year. It wasn't a clerical mistake. It was theft, deliberate and coordinated, and it pointed directly back to two people, Marcus Foster and Lauren Van. The woman who had once stood frozen and silent while being humiliated in front of an entire dining room was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. When Lauren, sensing the walls closing in, tried to buy her silence with a $15,000 bribe over coffee at a quiet cafe, Valerie didn't take the money. She asked calm, calculated questions about Marcus's involvement instead, and she recorded every single second of it. This wasn't rage. It was precision. The very same precision that had once color-coded a thesis in blue and red ink, now aimed squarely at the people who had spent years counting on her staying quiet forever. She wasn't just reclaiming money. She was reclaiming the version of herself she had buried for 8 years. The woman who read every line before signing, who trusted her own mind completely, who refused to shrink just because someone with more money demanded that she should. At the emergency partners meeting, Irene laid out everything in careful order. The authentic 2014 contract, the forged 2016 amendment, a handwriting expert's sworn findings, and finally, the recording of Lauren attempting to bribe her way out of the truth. The partners didn't hesitate for long. Valerie's 17% ownership was formally restored, along with financial compensation reflecting 8 years of company growth, $983,000 in total. Lauren fled the meeting in disgrace. Marcus Foster was eventually prosecuted, and the woman who had once mocked a waitress for supposedly not being able to read was made to testify against him in open court. 3 weeks later, Valerie trained her own replacement, said quiet goodbyes to coworkers who had never known her full story, and walked out of Celestial 34 for the very last time. Not fired, not pushed out, but leaving entirely on her own terms. Valerie's story took 8 years to come full circle, and it's worth being honest about that. It wasn't overnight, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. There were long stretches where she genuinely doubted whether the truth would ever matter to anyone but her. Real justice rarely moves as fast as we wish it would, and not every story of quiet endurance ends in a courtroom victory. What made the real difference here wasn't luck. It was her refusal to stop paying attention, even during the years when nothing seemed to be changing at all. Today, Valerie runs a small office in Brooklyn. On her desk, tucked safely under a sheet of glass, sits an old $2 bill. Not kept as a wound, but as a quiet reminder that the people who underestimate a patient, determined person, are usually the ones who end up paying the highest price of all. She never got her 4 lost years back, but she got herself back. And in the end, that turned out to be worth far more than the money ever could. If there's one thing her story leaves behind, it's this. Your silence today doesn't mean you've given up. Sometimes it simply means you're gathering the truth, one quiet detail at a time, patiently waiting for the exact moment you're finally ready to use it. This is Unstoppable Stories, because every great success story begins the moment someone refuses to give up. What part of Valerie's story hit you the hardest? Was it the humiliation at that table, or the moment she finally decided to speak up? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had absolutely no idea what you were truly capable of? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you even a little, subscribe to Unstoppable Stories for more powerful, honest journeys of resilience, patience, and the kind of quiet strength that wins in the end.